Well, hey, good morning, everyone. So whether you're here in the room with me or joining at one of our locations around the Pittsburgh region, I'm so glad that you're here this weekend. We're going to get into the message here in a second, but I wanted to get a couple things on your attention before we head into it. A couple things we've been talking about, but I want to keep them in front of you to remind you that they're coming up. One is called Behind and Beyond. This is our audio and our video podcast that we do, kind of giving you a peek behind the curtain of our sermons, how our sermons are developed, maybe some of the things that we were wrestling through as we were putting it together, and it just didn't make it into the message. So it kind of takes it and it makes it a little bit of an extra, an extension. Those come out on Wednesdays, and so you'll be seeing that every single week throughout this series. You can check that out on YouTube, on our app, on our website, anywhere you can get podcasts, it's going to be on there. So that's a great resource if you want to dig in a little bit deeper. The second thing is we have a conference coming up in March 16th. It's under the umbrella of our Project 167 initiative. This is a project that focuses on families, and so we're going to have a guest speaker, Mark Batterson, come and to speak with us, and it's going to be a great time to get to hear from him. If you know Mark is the lead pastor at a multi-site church in Washington, D.C. called National Community Church, similar to Northway, but he's written a lot of books, a lot of great resources about relational dynamics and about prayer. And so he's going to come, he's going to speak to us kind of in those areas as well. And so we want to make sure that date's on your calendar, and then when you're ready that you can register for that as well. It's going to be a great weekend. So don't forget about those two resources that we're putting out for you. They're both going to be really good things for you to dig into. And so, last week we kicked off this series. Dave kicked this series off, and he was talking about how central the table was to Jesus' life and ministry, how many conversations he had around the table, how many challenges he extended to people around the table. And if you were with us last week, I got the chance to be at our city location last week. Good morning, city location. And when this table came up on the screen, I looked at that table and I thought, that thing is beautiful. Like, it was symmetrical. All the candles were in place. The silverware looked great. The plates. There were little details and knickknacks in that centerpiece that just made it feel warm and inviting. And my first thought when that came up on the screen was, that's amazing. And then my second thought was, mine never looks like that. And so welcome to the Reilly's table. It's not as decorated. You're not going to find many candles. The wax you're going to find is probably Crayola. You're going to find a lot of dried Play-Doh. You're going to find some toys underneath. You're going to find a lot of homework at our table sometimes that you have to move out of the way before you can even sit down and eat. Our table's not perfect. Our chairs aren't as cool as these. They've got a lot of scratches and dents that are sometimes embarrassing when people come over and they see them. On the corner of one of the corners of our table, we have something that nobody else has. Custom artwork from one of our kids who thought, you know what this table needs? More Sharpie. We have that. You don't have that. We have that. But the thing that we've come to value so much about the table in our home over the years is not so much the way it looks. Sometimes it looks fancy, sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time it doesn't. What we've really come to value is these kind of stories that we're talking about. These stories of conversations around the table. Stories of hours of playing board games with our kids. Stories of conversations with guests that have come over. Conversations with our kids as they've grown up. As we've sat around the table, we've read the Bible together. They've wrestled with things as they've grown and they've matured. The stories that we have around our table are so valuable to us. And that's the whole point of this series, is inviting people around our table to create stories that will last for eternity. Even after all the messiness of life is gone, there's something that will last into eternity. And that's what we've come to really value. And so what we've done is we've gathered these stories for this series to share these moments when Jesus gathers people around the table and has conversations and challenges them in different ways. And the story that I want to share with you today, it comes from the Gospel of Luke. But I thought before we even read it, I want to give a little context to Luke, because I think the context really matters. You see, if you're relatively new to faith or new to the scriptures, the Bible has 4 Gospels. These are the accounts of Jesus' life. And these Gospels, they have different kind of angles and different language to how they share the story of Jesus. Matthew, for example, he's the first one when you turn in the New Testament. Matthew, more than anybody else, uses Old Testament quotes and references. His book is saturated with the Old Testament, meaning that you can tell that his audience was a Jewish audience, that he wanted them to see and experience and understand Jesus from their own cultural heritage, from their religious perspective. And so he speaks to them in a way that they can understand. And then you have Mark. Mark is the shortest of all the Gospels. It's also the fastest of all the Gospels. Scholars will kind of unanimously agree, or maybe not all scholars, but a lot of scholars will agree that Mark was probably Peter's account. That Peter would speak these things and Mark and God guiding them, but Mark would write down as a secretary, he would capture Peter's thoughts. And I don't know how impossible that would be to capture Peter's thoughts. Because this is a guy who was always jumping out of boats and cutting off ears, right? You've seen Peter in the Gospels. How hard would it be? It's like, it reads like one long run-on sentence. And we did this, and we did this, and we did this. And his favorite word is immediately. And immediately we went and did this. And so that, along with a few other details, lets us know that he was probably writing to a Roman audience, which wrote in this kind of faster-paced style. Then you have John, and John is completely outside the box. He doesn't have as much of a narrow audience. He uses words like everyone and all. He paints with a broad brush, and he paints it very differently than the other authors. He includes things that they don't include, and he doesn't include things that they do include. And he has this unique perspective on Jesus. And what's interesting about those three, if you think of Matthew and you think of Peter through Mark and you think of John, these were all eyewitnesses. They were there. They saw it. They saw the miracles. They experienced it. They ate bread and fish and drank wine with Jesus. They experienced all this stuff around the table with Jesus. But then Luke is different because Luke was not an eyewitness. He doesn't enter into the story until later in the book of Acts. Instead, Luke is a collection of many eyewitness accounts where he was sent out to investigate and to dig in and to figure out what is going on with all these stories that are circulating about Jesus. Listen how he begins his gospel. He says this in verse 1 of chapter 1, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word," he's talking about the other gospel authors here, "they have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught." So Luke, he's got a singular audience. He's got Theophilus, and there's a lot of theories about who that person is, and that's not really relevant to where we're going today. But what we need to see here is that what Luke did was he went out and he collected stories. He went out and he spoke to people. He was a physician by trade, so he was a detailed man. He went out and he gathered details. He interviewed people. How does he know the details that we talk about every Christmas? Details that only Mary would know. He probably went out and he spoke with Mary. How does he know details about the feeding of the 5,000? Well, he probably went out and talked to some of the people that ate that food that day. How does he know details about the transfiguration when Jesus' glory jumps over from heaven to earth for this moment and he sees Moses and Elijah up there? He wasn't there. How does he know? He probably went out and he talked to Peter and James and John, the men that were on that mountain that evening. And what's fascinating to me about that context, what that shows me is that everything that Luke brought back was a result of eyewitness accounts. And last week, Dave shared, I think he shared it kind of through Tim Chester's book, Meals with Jesus, but Chester was actually quoting somebody else different named Robert Karras. And I want you to listen what Robert Karras says about the Gospel of Luke in his book, Eating Your Way Through Luke's Gospel. He says this, he says, "In Luke's Gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal." In other words, you can trace this thread all the way through the Gospel of Luke of Jesus sharing time around the table with people. And I love that summary because you know what that tells me is that as he went out and he interviewed people and he collected these stories, the primary thing that he came back with was stories around the table of people remembering their time with Jesus, breaking bread, and him challenging them and loving them and caring for them in a way that they have never experienced before. It's one of the primary things that Luke brought back when he went out to investigate. So let me ask you this question. If Luke were around today and he were to go out and to interview the people that are around us, to interview our neighbors, to interview our coworkers, our kids, our extended families, what kind of stories would he bring back? It's a really convicting question for me. I don't know how that feels for you. But to think if he would go out and ask people about stories of my life and my interaction with them, what kind of stories would he bring back? Would he bring back stories around the table? Would he bring back stories of encouragement that I shared with them? Would he bring back stories of a hopeless situation that when we got together, they found some hope? Stories of Jesus even, of me sharing my faith? Would he bring back those kind of stories? What kind of stories would Luke be bringing back about Northway Christian Community if he were to go out and interview like that? You know, last week Dave talked a little bit about one of the apprehensions that we have when it comes to this table, like to actually opening up our home, opening up our spaces and inviting people in to our tables. And he said that one of the factors is risk, that we tend to look at it through the lens of risk. What is this going to cost me? How is this going to inconvenience me? How is this going to distract me from the things that I want to do? But he put it really brilliant. If you didn't catch the message, go back and see it. But he said that God doesn't look through the lens of risk, he looks through the lens of reach. In other words, who needs to be at this table? Who needs to hear about Jesus through you, through us? Who needs encouragement and hope through the table? And I think risk is a big one, but I think that there's another factor that even if we do get the boldness and we make the invite and we get them around the table, I think there's another factor that can come into play. Another factor that we can really wrestle with once the invitation has been made, once they're sitting at our table. And that's kind of what we're going to unfold today. It's in a story that's in the Gospel of Luke going out and talking with people, and he brings this back. It's a short story, it's a familiar story, but don't let that familiarity to wash over you, because there's some great truth in here. It's found in Luke 10, the very end of the chapter, and this is what it says. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." So on the surface, this is kind of a normal story. It's a normal story because we see Martha invite Jesus into her home, and she's doing what we would expect her to do. Based on biblical customs, based on the ancient customs of the day, hospitality was a big deal. And so to invite somebody into your home meant that you would serve them. You would go above and beyond to care for them, to provide for them. And so this story is sometimes misunderstood as Jesus calling out her busyness, but he's not calling out her service. He's not calling out her hospitality. Because even if you remember last week, one of the things that Jesus rebuked Simon the Pharisee about was that he didn't provide hospitality. He didn't give him water to wash his feet when he entered the home. He didn't give him oil to anoint his head and to show that he is an honored guest. And so what Jesus is calling out here is not just her busyness. He's calling out something deeper, something that she's wrestling with. Because in her heart, a long time before she spoke, there was something bothering her. You can just imagine as she's going around and she's getting the food ready and she's getting the drinks ready and she's setting the table. All the while that she's running around, she's got this side eye on Mary. She's looking at Mary and thinking, my sister's just sitting there. She's not doing anything. What's frustrating Martha in this moment is that she had an expectation of what her sister should be doing, and her sister wasn't living up to it. She had the whole evening planned out. She knew exactly where this should go. And so she's not looking at this through the lens of risk. She's looking at this through the lens of expectation. She knew where everyone was going to sit. She knew what was going to be on the playlist that evening. She knew everything on the menu. She had it all mapped out, and it all began to unravel in front of her. Mary was just a spark that started that. She had these unmet expectations that were driving her crazy. They were giving her trouble and anxiety. Everybody's favorite playwright that we love to read in high school, William Shakespeare, he once said, "Expectation is the root of all heartache." And that's what Martha is dealing with right now. Is she has an unmet expectation in her life. An unmet expectation about how the evening should go and how it is going. Have you ever had an unmet expectation in your life? Like at work, you have a project that's been assigned to you, but you've got other people that are a part of that project, and you know exactly how that project should go, but other folks in your group, they're skipping steps, they're missing details, and now you've got to turn something into your boss that it's not your best work, and you're worried because you're thinking, they're going to think this is what I turn in. Have you ever had an unmet expectation in your marriage? There's a good test for whether you've ever had an unmet expectation in your marriage. Are you married? That's the whole test. That's the whole test. Because we go into those relationships with hearts on our eyes, and we think that we've found the soulmate that will solve so many things in our life. And then a little while into it, we realize, oh, wait, I married a sinner who's broken just like me. And marriage is going to take a little bit more work than I thought it was going to take. Have you ever had an unmet expectation here in the church? We'll stand up on these platforms and we'll encourage you to do something great, to be a part of a small group, to get into something like Rooted, this 10-week discipleship program that we have. And you might sit out here and think, no, I'm not going to do that, because I tried a small group one time and I got in there, I wanted to read the Bible and process with other people and be cared for by other people, but that's not what happened. We didn't read the Bible that much because that one guy just kept talking the whole time. And that one lady, she kind of creeped me out. And we didn't read the Bible. So I've done that before. It's not what I expected. I'm not doing it again. You ever think when you have an unmet expectation, where does that come from? Have you ever stopped to process what that is? Where does that come from? Well, I think for Martha, there's two things in here that as I was reading through this passage this week, I saw them clearly, not because I necessarily see them in Martha, but I see them in me. I think that we often have unmet expectations because we have unrealistic expectations. We set the bar so high, so ridiculous, that we don't often think about why do we have these expectations in our life. So before she even said anything, Martha is wrestling with what's going on, and when this bubbles up, she goes to Jesus and she says, Jesus, look at her. She's not serving. Tell her to do this. And what is she really saying in that moment? She's saying, Jesus, tell her to be like me. Tell her to welcome you like I welcome you. Tell her to serve you like I served you. Tell her to be like me. And I think this is important for us to hear, that when we open up our homes and we open up our spaces and invite people to our table, we are going to meet people that are not like us. And that's a good thing. We're going to meet people that have had a very different upbringing than we've had. We're going to meet people that may vote very differently than we vote. We're going to meet people that have raised their children very differently than you've raised your children. We're going to meet people that have a very different view of God than you have a view of God. And we're going to have to figure out, how do we navigate the differences? How do we navigate the fact that we have invited them into our mess and we've invited their mess into ours? There's going to be differences. There's going to be struggles as we have these conversations. But that's the big idea here, is that an invitation to the table is not an invitation to be more like you. It's an invitation to encounter Jesus. It's an invitation to allow him to transform them, to be sovereign as he is, and to surrender over to him. So I think that we have unrealistic expectations. And that's when they become unmet expectations. I think there's another factor that plays in there, though. It's not just that we have unrealistic expectations. I think that oftentimes we have uncommunicated expectations. That we have uncommunicated expectations. Did you notice that when Martha finally does get frustrated and she goes over to them, what does she say to Mary? Nothing. She doesn't talk to Mary. She talks around Mary. She talks to Jesus directly. She says, look at her. She doesn't communicate with her. I wonder if there was a moment, even before all this started to happen, did she ever sit down with Mary and say, hey, here's the things that I would like some help with this evening. Here's where I'm going to feel a little stressed out. Could you maybe step in and help me and provide this and do this? I don't think that she did. I think that was just boiling up inside of her. She had this expectation, this mental picture of how the evening should go, and she didn't share it with her sister. I think we see that with Jesus too. She does the same thing to him. Because if you look at the entirety of this story, you can tell that the host, Martha, and the guest, Jesus, they have two very different agendas of how this evening should go. Two very different ideas. Martha's got it all mapped out. Not only does she have the details and the food mapped out, but she's got the conversation probably mapped out in her head. This is where it needs to go this evening. But Jesus has a different idea in mind. And I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind as well when we open up our homes and our spaces and we allow people around our table, is that we should hold our agendas very loosely, because Jesus may want to take it in a completely different direction. We need to be continually in prayer to hear from him. Because we may have this plan. We may have a great plan. Maybe you've been through Rooted and now you know how to tell your story, which is a great thing. But maybe Jesus doesn't want you to tell your story that evening. Because maybe in his sovereignty, he knows what they need most is for somebody to listen to their story. Because no one has in a long time. And so maybe your story is for the next time. And see, in her busyness, in her trouble, in her anxiety, Martha missed that. She missed what Jesus was wanting to do that evening. And I don't know about you, but I think that that's one of the big temptations I have in life. When I get distracted, when I get busy, when I get anxious, when I get troubled like Martha, I think one of the first things I'm tempted to put aside is my relationship with Jesus, is my communication with Jesus. I put aside time in his word because I'm too busy. I put aside time in prayer to listen to him because I'm too distracted. And I end up missing what he's wanting to do in my life and maybe in the lives of others around me. So that's why I think prayer is such a key to this element, that as you invite people into your home, first you should invite who you've prayed for. Have you spent time praying and saying, Lord, who do you want to invite around my table? Who needs to hear from us? Because I can promise you this, he has been working on their heart longer than you've been thinking about them and praying about them. This is just a moment in the plan that he has for them. So pray as to who you're going to invite. One of the best things you can do to open the door of faith in a conversation around your table at home is to pray to begin the meal. Many of us already do that, but our guests may not. But it's one of those things that is kind of a common knowledge, even if they've only seen it in maybe movies before, but it's going to open a door and let them know, oh, this person has faith. Their family prays before meals. And it's a great opportunity not to just thank God for the food, but thank him for the guests. Thank you that they're around my table. Thank you that we get to share this evening together. I'm so excited that they're here. And then finally, we need to be praying as we go along through the evening to do what Paul talks about in the New Testament, where he says to pray without ceasing. So yeah, you're having a conversation, you're still paying attention to them, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, Lord, where do you want this conversation to go? What is your agenda for the evening? And your sovereignty, what do they need to hear? What word of encouragement needs to come out of me, from you, through me, to them? See, prayer should be such a big element in all of this, that we should not leave these things go uncommunicated just because we want to get all the details right. And we want to make sure that they can't necessarily see the mess that we have around our tables. So I want to go back to Martha because I don't want to miss something important. You'll notice that when Jesus calls her out, he says, Martha, you're distracted and you're troubled and you're anxious about many things. And the words that he uses, it paints a picture. Because the word trouble in the original language, kind of the root of it, it means noise. It's not a pleasant noise. It's a loud, annoying, crying, gonging noise. And the word anxious that he uses, it gives this idea of more than just nervousness. It's that your full attention, your full focus is on this thing. He's saying, Martha, your full focus is on the noise of all your expectations. Your full focus is on the noise of all the things around you, and you're missing me. I'm sitting right in front of you, and you're missing me. What's really significant about this is that Luke, when he's capturing Jesus' words, just a few chapters before, he uses that word anxious again, and it's in a parable about a farmer who goes out to sow seeds. The familiar parable to a lot of us, that he goes out, he sows seeds. The farmer is God in this parable, and the seeds are his word. And he goes out to sow these seeds, and as he sows them, some of them fall on the path and they get trampled on, and Jesus says that those are the ones that get taken away by the devil. Some fall on the rock, and they don't get to grow because they never grow roots, and then the trials of things just take them away. And then the third is the thorns. Some of the seed falls among the thorns, and this is how Jesus describes this. He says, as for what fell among the thorns, they are those who hear, but as they go on their way, they are choked by the cares or the anxieties, that's that word, the cares and the riches and the pleasures of life, and their fruit does not mature. So he says, with all this distraction, all this anxiety, with all your focus on all the noise of your expectations, you're missing me. And you're not growing. Your fruit is stale, it's stagnant, it's not growing, it's immature. You're missing the opportunity to grow because you're so worried about all the details. You're so worried about how this evening should go. And so here's the big question. Are we willing to trade our expectations for someone else's eternity? Are we willing to set aside the pride of getting everything right and invite people into the mess of our homes, the mess of our lives, for their eternity? Are we willing to trade our expectations, the expectations of how we think things should go, of how the conversation should go, of how they should think, how they should believe? Are we willing to set those things aside so that Jesus can use us in conversation so they can taste eternity? That's the big question. You know, last week Dave shared that only 30% of families regularly share meals around the table. And when I was growing up, I was definitely in the 70%. I'm sure many of you were as well, because that's a big statistic. For us, dinner time was you grabbed your plate, you grabbed your food, it was self-service, you go to your room, you watch Batman cartoons. That's what I did when I was a kid. It wasn't until I got in college I really began to see the value of having a meal around the table. I became a Christian my last year in college. I didn't grow up in church. I didn't even step foot inside of a church until I was in my 20s. And as soon as I got into this local church, I met a couple named Tom and Sandy Ben. And Tom and Sandy, they were volunteers in the church, and they designed a ministry and led it themselves. And it was a ministry for college students where they would adopt us. That was kind of the word they used. They would adopt college students who were away from home and maybe just needed some care. And so what they would do is they would sit with us in the service. They would take us out to lunch afterwards. They'd let us come over their home. They'd let us do our laundry for free, which was awesome. They'd feed us a lot of food, which was the best part of it. Sandy was an amazing cook. Like, her food was legendary. When we would have church potlucks, people would run to get Sandy's food. It was so, so good, including these chocolate chip cookies that I'm telling you, they're the best chocolate chip cookies in the world. They're amazing. Tom and Sandy, they did more than feed us. You see, I started to hang around their house a lot, and so did a young lady who I was interested in at the time, Allison, who's now been my wife for 23 years. We got to spend a lot of time with Tom and Sandy, and it was significant for us because when we were growing up, we didn't have a lot of stability in either of our homes. Now, I've always been pretty open with my story of growing up in kind of a chaotic home where between my two parents, there's 7 marriages, 6 divorces, and I'm the youngest of 13 kids when you add up all the halves and step siblings. And I don't ever share that to shame my parents because I know my parents have their own brokenness and things that they wrestle with. I just share that to kind of set the story of Jesus rescued me from a lot of things. And so when I was growing into this idea of following Jesus, I didn't know how to do it. When I started to date Allison, I didn't really know how to date a girl well because I had not done it well before. When I was interested in marrying Allison, I had no idea how to be a husband, let alone be a Christian husband. But I learned a lot of it around the table with Tom and Sandy as they invited us into their home. And I got to watch him love his wife. And I got to watch them raise their daughter. I got to watch them do something so weird for a married couple. They would fight and still love each other. It was a big lesson for me. I got to see what a real marriage looked like. I got to see what a real dad looked like as he followed after Jesus. And when it came time for us to actually get married, one of the best gifts we got was we got this box, we opened it up, and inside was some of our favorite recipes from Sandy, including chocolate chip cookies, which now my wife makes, and yeah, I brought some. I didn't bring enough for the whole class. I brought just enough for me, and I'm totally going to eat this in front of you. But they're still amazing after all these years. So good. Just give me a second. But they fed us a lot more than food. They fed us wisdom. They fed us compassion. They knew our histories, and they cared for us so well, and they showed us how to live life. And we've been married 23 years, and so much of that success is because of Tom and Sandy. And I'll say that my eternity was changed around their table. And I'll forever be thankful to them. So much so that when we began to be a part of Northway, one of the things we did was we got hooked up with our Oakland campus, and Allison and I began to open our homes. Or open our home, we only have one. We opened our home to college students because that was such a valuable thing for us. And so we had a lot of college students around our table. to share with them exactly like somebody shared with us back in the day. See, Tom and Sandy made a significant impact on our life, and we wanted to do the same. I'm sure there were a lot of times where there were these expectations that they had in their mind. I'm sure there were a lot of times when we left their house a mess. There were a lot of times when we stayed too long, maybe inconvenienced them, maybe we distracted them in some way, but they felt like it was worth it. They felt like it was worth putting their expectations aside for our eternity. And they invested in us in big ways. And I think that Jesus operates well in those unexpected spaces. There's a detail I don't want us to miss in this passage before we move on. That if you'll notice, where is Mary sitting in this moment? She's sitting at the feet of Jesus. That is a phrase that paints a picture that we might not catch. To sit at the feet of someone means that you're learning from them intentionally and you're their disciple. To have a woman as a disciple for a rabbi back then was a very unexpected thing. And Jesus welcomed her, and he actually said, Martha, Martha. As he's giving her this correction, he says, Martha, Martha, which is a very kind and compassionate way to address her, giving her two names there. You're anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Listen, Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. You see, what Mary did was she chose in that moment. She chose this good portion. And the portion in the Bible, yes, it talks about food, but it also talks about salvation. A portion is a metaphor for salvation. In the Psalms, it says this, Psalm 73, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. In other words, what Mary has chosen is something eternal, because the plates may break, the food's gonna go away, someday there's not gonna be homework on the table, someday the table's not even gonna be there. These things are not gonna always matter in eternity. But what's gonna last into eternity are the conversations that we had, where we surrendered our expectations and we allowed Jesus to work in and through us to allow our neighbors to taste eternity. What a glorious invitation into ministry that is from Jesus. To see what he has done around the table and to invite us to get to do that as well. And that's the big question. Are we willing to choose the good portion, not only for ourselves, but for others? To lay aside our expectations, to invite people into our mess and say, Jesus, we know that you're sovereign and you can use us to make an eternal change in somebody's life. That's what this invitation is all about. That's what we're inviting you to do, to open up your homes, to gather people around your tables, and to make an impact for eternity. What a glorious invitation that is. Let me pray for us. So Father, first and foremost, I thank you for Tom and Sandy Ben, who are willing to look past the mess and to help others see eternity. I pray that we would all be bold enough to do the same, that we would be willing to open our homes, to gather people around our tables, to listen and communicate to you in such a way that we can be an encouragement to them, that they can walk away from our homes not saying, man, that was good lasagna, but instead, man, that was a great conversation. There is so much peace in that home. There's so much hope with that family. There's so much joy there. I want to go back. I want to learn more. Lord, help us to be bold as we invite and we care for people around our tables. We thank you for that opportunity and that privilege to do so. Jesus, we love you, and it's in your name that we pray. Amen.